Hello, I'm Adam and I'm here today to talk to you again about racial ideology and racial politics. I made another video, so this is really part two of that. And the reason I felt like I wanted to make another video on this topic is because, of course, this is March of 2012. It's turning into election year, so you're starting to see people fan the flames of race and make racial charges, charging people of racism and of one term I heard today was a dog whistle. Supposedly there are code words that create racial animosity, hidden racism, hidden signals to the electorate. And so I wanted to point out how, in fact, that on the political left, there are no dog whistles. The racial ideology is extremely specific and extremely laid out in very plain and harsh terms. The political left does not use dog whistles. They use very harsh language and calls explicitly to racial ideology and racial politics. So I wanted to cover some of that here. And one thing I wanted to point out, that if you look at the ideology that's dominant on the political left, in the left-wing establishment, especially in the universities, and it's spilled over into the courts, the Democratic Party, and into the media, is really a Nazi-like racist ideology. And in fact, if you look who has won the hearts and minds of the people, it's really Nazi Germany who won the 20th century. Of course, I'm not talking about who won on the battlefield, which really is irrelevant. What matters is who's won the hearts and minds of the people. And by the people, I guess I'm overstating it, because regular people don't ascribe to this. I would say the majority of them. Most regular people, left to their own devices, would see people as individuals, human beings, to be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin, or to judge people based on their own actions, individual human beings as our objective senses perceive them to be. Or as our religion would tell us, they are individual children of God, to be judged having their own individual soul and identity. But when you look at the racial ideology coming out of our campuses today, it's extremely specific and explicit, and it's very divisive. It's along an us versus them. All of these movements, and there are many, but they're all essentially the same. They follow the same script and use the same terminology as each other, and the same terminology and ideas as Nazi Germany. It's very dehumanizing ideology. It's irrational, as I'll discuss. It's destructive of liberty. It cannot be managed by anyone. It can't serve a purpose as someone's ends and then be put back in the box once it's unleashed. That can never happen. And ultimately, and always, it leads to hatred and violence unless people reject it. So that's why it's very important that we talk about this and understand it so we can reject it, especially as the United States goes through severe economic hardship in the coming years, because this economic hardship can lead to very serious problems of hatred and violence. And the fact that this ideology has built up over the last 40 years of relative prosperity is pretty amazing, because it's been so peaceful and there's been relative prosperity. But as the pie shrinks and we go through economic hard times in the current years, that's when you can see it really explode. The consequence of the ideology we've adopted in peaceful times will come into full view, and the consequences will be reaped in full. Again, it's the political left has rescued racism and racist ideology from the trash heap of history after the Civil War, the freeing of the slaves, the various amendments to the Constitution to give people their full rights as human beings, as the Founding Fathers had intended. Plus the end of Jim Crow and the defeat of Nazi Germany, you would think that racial ideology and racial politics would be in the scrap heap of history. But unfortunately, that's not true. They come back again because they're so easy for aspiring racial warlords to put out there, and for people to latch onto, the ignorant people. But it spreads into ever wider areas of society, from the universities on down. And again, there's no dog whistle. I'm going to quote some of the things that we hear. And again, it's racist ideology, racist identity, and racial socialism dominate the left-wing establishment. And it's really, though, when you look at it, it's really racial conformity that they're demanding, and the disunity of society. Because if you stand on your own as an individual with your individual identity, you will be denounced. The people who push forth racial ideology have a problem with people who don't follow their racial demands, that they act a certain way, that they think a certain way. So they're often called Uncle Toms, Oreo cookies in the case of black people, but there were Veneditos, I think was the term for Latinos who didn't adhere to the racial demands of the racial leaders. So it's very stifling. You're put into a box basically with this ideology. You have to think and act a certain way, and if you don't, there are real consequences. You'll be denounced, you'll be ridiculed, you can even be physically attacked. It's very common. And this will get worse as society goes through economic hardship in the coming years. And it's an inferior diversity. They try and make this up as something called diversity, but it's not really diversity, it's conformity. Real diversity, the superior diversity, is the diversity of 300 million individual human beings, each with their own characteristic and ideas and talents and shortcomings, their own virtues and vices, not the 5 or 6 or 7 crayon-like box ideologies and identities that are dictated from the top down. That's not diversity at all. It's racial conformity, and it's very stifling. I would hate to be in that situation where I fell into that trap. And again, it's no dog whistles needed. It's very explicit, as I'm going to show. It's based on mysticism. It's a racist religion, really. And any college that allows this to be taught, because it's not scientific, should lose their accreditation. Probably almost every college in America should lose their accreditation for allowing these racist religions to be taught as science on college campuses to the unsuspecting students. And it conflicts with individualism because, again, we are all the individual human beings we seem to our senses. There's no invisible realm where people of like ethnicity or race are connected in a magical way, a supernatural way. That to espouse that without proof is, again, it's a religion, it's mysticism. It has no basis in objective reality. It's anti-Christian, as I pointed out. So if you're adhered to this mystical, supernatural spirituality, then you're defying the commandment to not to worship false gods and have false religions. And it's against science. So, and again, it comes from the German philosophy of the 1800s, really. Philosophers like Kant and Hegel, who put forth the notion that that individual human beings are not really what you see, that they don't exist, that they're an illusion, and that really we're part of the larger collective whole that we don't see, and that it should be, all individuals should be part of the collective whole of the race or the nation. Anything that's individual should be submissive and subordinate to the collective whole, which is what the racial warlords want as well. In fact, you always hear, when I bring up Nazism, you always hear Hitler described as the most evil person in all of human history. And there's a case that can be made that he was. But you hear that most loudly from the people who steal his ideas, who ought to be paying him royalties for saying a lot of the same things that he said. And not much different, in fact, virtually identical. So, and for instance, when you look at it, when you look at the German what the German philosophers were saying, it was very similar to what you hear people saying today. The idea that, for instance, Mussolini said, to fascism, the world is not the material world which appears on the surface, in which man is an individual separated from other men. Basically, he was saying the world as we see it does not exist, and that we're all part of a collective ideology in some mystical, magical, spiritual way. And that people of ethnicities or races share a supernatural experience in some realm through their collective consciousness or a collective soul or collective experiences or some magical property in blood. And again, it leads to hatred and violence because the idea is to push forth resentment, to create a class of people separate from everybody else, to spread disunity, to rob people of their individual identities and to make them part of basically a herd of a herd mentality that can be led by the people putting this forth. And sometimes it's done cynically, but sometimes it's very genuine, the people who are espousing these racist ideas. And just because it's cynical doesn't mean you can put it back in the box. Often today's radical is tomorrow's Uncle Tom. Some racist agitator will whip up racial or ethnic tension, and then when they've achieved what they wanted, whether it's political office or prominence or wealth or whatever it is that they want, we'll try to then put it back in the box, but it won't go back into the box. And if they don't persist, then there will be others who are more sincere, more radical, will push them aside. They will become the Uncle Toms and be replaced. So the conformity is never ending because it constantly gets more radical and more demands are put on people to how they should think and what they should think. And that can change with the demands of these leaders. And if anyone tries to get off the boat, you're often pushed aside and denounced, and you can be denounced as an Uncle Tom yourself, or an Oreo, or a Vivandito, whatever the term is. All these racial movements have the same script. There's nothing new or unique about this. It went back to Germany. You know, the idea that a German was a German and a Jew was a Jew. You see that today taught on American campuses. It's amazing that we have allowed these people to get into positions of power to spread their poison around the country. And it has to be explicitly rejected, or we're all going to see the consequences, every single one of us. And most people reject it, but it comes from the top, and it has an effect, especially on unsuspecting students. History shows that people tend to drink this stuff up. Young people who don't have any life experience, especially, who go to colleges and look up to these professors, and they're taught instead of to achieve something themselves, but to adopt literally a self-destructive ideology of racial conformity and racial division, and it leads to violence and bloodshed always, unless it's turned back and rejected. So that's why I'm making this video, because people need to reject it. And again, it's not American conservatism, these so-called dog whistles or these hidden racism that people can never point to, which is why they call them invisible, or a dog whistle that no one can hear because they're not there. This is explicit. The calls for, here's a college professor, one right here, calling for this. It says, he's basically calling for the end of white America, that they're dying, and white people are shaken with fear, and that he's excited about that. Here it is. We have an aging white America. They are not making babies. They are dying. The explosion is in our population. I love it. They are shitting their pants with fear. I love it. This is a college professor on an American campus. This is not unusual. This is, in fact, common. In fact, it's typical of what you see on many college campuses today. And you'll see with American tax dollars even, students going to colleges learning this terrible ideology, which will lead to a terrible future for all of us. So we all have to reject it. People of all races have to say, I'm an individual human being. I'm not buying into your Nazi-like racist ideology. I reject it. As a Christian, I'm an individual human being, a soul-possessing child of God who will be judged based on my individual sins or virtues or vices. And from a scientific perspective, we are the people we appear to our senses. We are individual human beings as we appear. There is no mystical, magical, supernatural realm where we share this fantasy of collective experiences that transcend time and space, intergenerational grudges and sins, historical victims and victimizers. We have to reject it. We have to reject these people. We have to reject their ideas, and we have to purge them from high office, our college campuses, political offices, the courts. And the fact that we're not doing that, and we pretend these people are intellectuals when they're clearly not. History shows they're not. You just read what the Nazis said, and it's essentially the same thing. And I don't want to see America go down that path. It doesn't serve the people's interest. It might serve particular individuals, cynical individuals or hateful individuals, but it doesn't serve the people. It doesn't serve the country. It doesn't serve any of us. So we have to reject it and learn to live as individual human beings. Get along and just work on improving ourselves and living our individual lives. Thank you.